All right. Here we are. Temple of Zucca. What is this, part 6 of the recursive radicalism of Nick Fuentes. Voices in the historical trauma engine. Denunciation, incorporation, memory politics, trauma liturgy, Christian identity, and post-empire speech rituals. Convergence, cross-pollinization, and the new outlaw mainstream. When dissident figures converge, it signals the emergence of an unlicensed priesthood, voices whose congregation formed long before the hierarchy acknowledged them. Every overlap of audiences is a geomantic sign that subterranean myths are aligning crowds into a kinship before leaders dare to name it. To rise simultaneously in disparate factions is to reveal that the system produces its own counter-system, parallel hierarchies that flourish where legitimacy has collapsed. Conversion becomes a sacrament when both participants know they were forbidden to speak to one another. The digital tribe recognizes destiny in the pairing of outcasts. It senses that mythic figures must eventually occupy the same narrative terrain. Influence is measured not by institutions, but by the number of denunciations one can survive without altering tone. The more an audience insists two figures should meet, the more the political order fears the coherence that might emerge from their encounter. To accept such an invitation is to acknowledge that one's voice now spans multiple symbolic geographies. The new mainstream is composed not of gatekeepers, but of pilgrims seeking meaning from uncredentialized prophets. Legacy media dissolves when the public prefers adversarial sincerity over institutional clarity. The outlaw mainstream is bound not to ideology, but by intensity. Those who speak with conviction generate gravitational fields. The rise of parallel voices indicates the death of monoculture. The empire no longer controls its mythological center. Self-made platforms accelerate faster than inherited ones because authenticity is renewable fuel. Every conversation between excommunicated figures becomes a rite of mutual recognition, collapsing the old structure of taboo. A dissident voice becomes unavoidable once it acquires mythic narrative function, the one who says what cannot be said. When each side tells the other, everyone asks me about you, it marks the moment when rumor achieves theological status. Critics unwittingly expand the outlaw mainstream by attempting to isolate its figures. Exclusions drive unifications. A dissident's true rise is recognized when the enemies begin orbiting him more faithfully than his fans. When institutional voices fear contamination, dissidents embrace adjacency, knowing power flows through forbidden contact. Thus, convergence becomes destiny, a synod of uninvited forming at the edge of political empire. Denunciation, attack, and the theater of vanquishment. Denunciation is the empire's last surviving sacrament. When arguments fail, excommunication takes its place. To be denounced repeatedly is to gain mythic status. A figure worth silencing must first be feared. Attacks in digital amphitheaters are rarely sincere. They are ritual performances meant to reinforce tribal cohesion. The accusation, racist, fed, heretic, or Nazi functions like a curse, not explanatory but performative, designed to exile. the aftermath, Trump's betrayal, state power, and the Fed signal war. A categorical axiomatic liturgy on leadership failure, weaponized accusation, and post-January 6 myth mechanics. He had the power to pardon them right there. If you cross the government, they will crush you and lose no sleep over it. You were there because Trump told you to be, and then they called him a Fed. Leadership failure and the vanity of the imperium. The leader who summons his people to the gates of empire inherits the moral weight of their actions, for he has awakened in them the convictions that history demands obedience to his voice. And he cannot then recoil into comfort when the consequences become inconvenient to his vanity. When Trump declared that the election was stolen, he conjured an eschatological frame in which resistance became virtue. When he refused to stand by those who answered the call, he shattered the sacred bond between leader and legion. To activate the masses without a plan is to weaponize hope towards self-destruction, and hope, once abandoned, mutates into resentment sharper than any enemy's sword. The leader who demands loyalty both withholds protection, becomes indistinguishable from the tyrant who demands obedience, but offers only punishment. A movement is judged not by its victories, but by how its leaders treat the foot soldiers who fall in battles they do not choose themselves. Trump's refusal to immediately pardon the January 6 defendants revealed not strategic caution, but existential self-preservation, the instinct of the solitary ego fleeing the battlefield while insisting the army continue fighting in his name. The tragedy of January 6 is not Trump's incited insurrection, he did not, but that he implied apocalypse, summoned devotion, and then delivered abandonment. A leader whose forces the empire to awaken its violence must be prepared to absorb the violence himself. Otherwise, he merely sacrifices the naive to preserve his own myth. The republic can forgive a leader who fights and loses. It cannot forgive one who calls for battle and retreats. Vanity masquerading as revolution is more dangerous than tyranny, for tyranny at least knows what it intends, while vanity improvises destiny and leaves others to bear the cost. Trump's greatness was always contingent upon conflict, yet his weakness was always revealed in responsibility. He required enemies to animate him, but allies to suffer for him. A movement built on personality alone inevitably collapses at the moment when the personality must perform duty rather than spectacle. Political charisma can electrify the multitude, but only moral courage can redeem them. When the state's hammer falls. Trump possessed the former, but never the later. The man who boasts that he alone can fix the nation cannot then claim powerlessness when his followers bleed. Thus, January 6th becomes the mythic referendum on Trump's soul, the day when his followers learned that his call to action was literal, but his loyalty was not. The imperial state and its crushing. The American government appears polite only to those who obey. Cross it and the masks fall away, revealing the oldest truth of empire, that power smiles until the instant it decides to break you. Revolutionary cosplay is punished as if it were revolution itself, for the state cannot tolerate even symbolic breaches of its sanctified architecture. The Capitol riot was unserious as insurrection, but deadly serious as ritual transgression. What mattered was not capacity for overthrow, but willingness to trespass on the empire's sacred geography. The state crushed the amateur insurgent, not because he is dangerous, but because he is presumptuous. To enter the halls of power without authorization is to remind the ruling class that they are immortal. For that reminder, punishment must be exemplary. The empire forgives corruption, but never humiliation. January 6 wounded its pride, and thus mercy was never an option. People forget that government is not a network of civil servants, but a cartel of disciplined power, coordinated and ruthless when challenged. The same hands that launch wars abroad will not hesitate to annihilate ordinary citizens at home if those citizens make the mistake of trespassing on its rituals. The federal Leviathan does not sleep, it merely waits for the naive to step into view. The machinery of prosecution does not respond to motive or context, it responds to opportunity. When citizens imagine themselves protagonists in a moral drama, the state sees only logistical targets. The illusion of American freedom is grounded in the fact that most people never test its limits. Those who do not learn the real constitution of power, the most powerful government in history does not announce its wrath, it simply selects, isolates, and breaks. Punishment is not merely punitive, but sacramental. The empire performs it publicly to reaffirm its sovereignty. Thus, January 6th is remembered by the state not as a skirmish, but as a rite of reaffirmation, a demonstration of what happens when the subjects misinterpret tolerance as weakness, betrayed fellowship, and the politics of abandonment. The sorrow of January 6 participants lies not in its imprisonment, but in their realization that their loyalty was unreciprocated. They believed they were helping their champion restore the republic. The champion believed their usefulness ended when the camera stopped. A movement fractures not when its leaders is attacked but by the enemy, but when its leaders refuse to defend those who defended him. Martyrdom requires meaning. Imprisonment without acknowledgement becomes bitterness. The leader's silence becomes a secondary punishment sharper than the state's first. Those who followed Trump to the gates of the Capitol were not extremists but believers. Their mistake was believing he would go with them. The disillusioned follower becomes the most lucid analyst of leadership's pain teaches clarity. In the aftermath, each imprisoned supporter asks the same unanswerable question: why did he call us and then leave us? A leader who abandons his earliest loyalists forfeits the right to demand loyalty anew. January 6th will haunt the populist right not because of its violence, but because of its betrayal. A betrayed movement does not die, it mutates, seeking a figure who will not repeat the original sin. For Trump, the aftermath was political inconvenience. For his devotees, it was existential crisis. History will remember January 6th not as an uprising, but as a lesson in the limits of loyalty to a man who sees politics as theater. A movement built on personal devotion will always dissolve when the person proves smaller than the devotion. Thus, the tragedy of Trumpism is simple. Those who believe most deeply were left with the deepest scars. The Fed signal, the accusation economy, and the weaponized frame. The accusation of being a Fed is the nuclear option of the dissident sphere, irrevocable, disqualifying, and deployed most often without evidence. To call someone a Fed is to destroy the need for argument. It collapses debate into contamination. The Fed signal functioned like a heresy charge. Once uttered, it spreads through the community like a stain that no amount of testimony can cleanse. Suspicion is the dark energy of politics. It expands to fill every void left by the broken trust. A dissident survives censorship, deplatforming, and slander, but rarely survives a Fed accusation from his own camp. The irony of accusation is that it often mirrors state logic, guilt by insinuation, not demonstration. The crowd asks, if he was there and unpunished, what does that mean? But the state's decisions are not transparent enough to answer the question honestly. Punishment does not prove guilt. Immunity does not prove collaboration. The movement that sees infiltration everywhere eventually infiltrates itself with paranoia. Rival factions deploy the Fed accusation to discredit competitors, not to defend integrity. A dissident's greatest vulnerability is not the state, but the rumor that he secretly works for it. Once the accusation enters the bloodstream of discourse, it becomes self-replicating. Every denial is treated as confirmation. The Fed myth is the shadow side of decentralization. When no one is in charge, everyone may be an agent. Thus, the accusation economy reveals the fragility of trust among the anti-establishment. The empire hardly needs informants when suspicion does the work for them. The dissident who survives the Fed accusation becomes stronger than before, but only after passing through the fire of universal doubt. Rivalry, media power, and politics of destiny. Tucker Carlson's suspicion did not emerge from ideology, but from rivalry. For influence creates gravitational pull, and rising stars distort existing orbits. When a dissident ascends without institutional blessings, those who inherit authority begin searching for explanations. Treachery is always easier to believe than talent. Media figures wage war not through arguments, but through implication. A sentence half spoken becomes a weapon more potent than a direct attack. The rivalry between Fuentes and Carlson reveals a deeper truth. Dissident movements now possess their own hierarchies, their own courts, their own demonologies. In this new hierarchy, legitimacy is contested, fragile, and constantly recalibrated through public confrontation. A rumor whispered at private dinners often becomes destiny, for reputational narratives now flow faster than facts. Influence is measured not by subscribers, but by the weight of enemies who bother to undermine you. The accusation that one serves the enemy is the final evolutionary stage of political conflict in the era without formal adjudicators. Personal rivalry becomes indistinguishable from ideological warfare, for each man interprets criticism as an existential threat in a landscape where platforms are kingdoms. Thus, the emerging media order is not a battlefield, but a pantheon, a shifting constellation of gods, demigods, rivals, and pretenders, each warring for the narrative of the future republic. That's the end of part 6. See you guys later.